One of the ubiquitous weapons of most RPG campaigns, most fantasy settings, is the hammer. We don't really appreciate the total concept behind the hammer. My particular hammer is part of my work truck toolbox and is highly greasy. So, it's not. Hope we don't find that one in the battlefield. The most commonly used by clerics, supposedly because their gods don't like them using as weapons or shedding blood, although apparently their gods have no problem with them crushing skulls and pulverizing bone and doing some seriously heavy duty contusion damage to their opponents. Of course, the weapon itself is a descendant of the weapons used by carpenters and blacksmiths, armorers, what have you, weaponsmiths of all eras. An early weapon can trace back basically to the club, an improvised club where somebody had taken a rock and tied it to a chunk of wood, and there you go. There's your first modern hammer. Supposed to be, I guess, considered a simplistic weapon, unsophisticated in its use. I mean, it's hard to argue that. You pick up basically a heavily balanced blunt object and pulverize something senseless with it. It's doubles in some aspects as a weapon that can be used in non-lethal combat, although make an argument that you're crushing bones and breaking skulls is still, sort of lethal. The opposing uses for these sort of things, of course, is for the non-battlefield use. One common use is battering down a door, battering off a lock, using it in campsites for driving stakes and so on and forth, because that's what tools are for. I mean, it's basically an oversized tool. I've seen them in many incarnations in 100 different kinds of movies. Everything from some very unwieldy looking, massive chunks of what look like a tree, basically, in the hands of a barbarian, and down to some very sophisticated, tiny little things that are more suited for a jeweler shop or a machinist than for the modern battlefield. Another sidebar of the weapon is that it's supposedly throwable, much because of its balanced effect. Obviously, we get a lot of that from Thor's hammer, so to speak. A very common, sought after enchantment of a hammer is the return. So, which it's makes it a little bit more versatile. You can use it as a limited ranged weapon in that aspect, and have it come back to your hands. Of course, the non-magical version where you throw it, put yourself at a disadvantage. That goes back to having more than one weapon in your belt, so to speak. If you tend to throw your primary weapon, although I would argue that throwing your primary weapon should only be done in an act of desperation or last resort, or when you're utterly confident that the beastie or bad guy that's running away from you doesn't have 16 friends waiting around the corner. Or you got a backup. Your group's got got your back, and you're good. The you know we don't look at the weapons per se from the perspective of the aesthetics and or their function, generally speaking. I think most players, especially new ones, come along and look at them from the amount of damage they do. Now, the damage given on the D&D charts for hammers is moderately low compared to a comparable melee weapon such as a sword. But where it compensates that is it gives you a higher chance of crits, and of course, yeah, there's a couple schools on too many rolls, too little rolls, using the dice too much. Uh, like I said, I've always been a fan of the older school rollmaster stuff, and one of the reasons for that was is because they had a large uh, breakdown of potential. I don't want to call it damage, but effects done by your weapons. So if you got a critical hit, it's like rolling on the hit location chart. There's a lot of people that feel that that's excessive mechanics and who cares where you hit somebody. Well, I will agree that in general melee, when we're just trying to overwhelm something, where you hit it is less important as to how many times you hit it and make it go away or make it go down. So there's not always a time and place to be rolling for a hit location. On the other hand, I am a fan of the hit location because, for starters, increases the chances of doing lethal or severe damage to an opponent in a specific manner. And what I mean by that, and I use this system in my own game system, Stellar Frontiers. The hit location chart is basically an enhanced version of the crit chart. And in this case, if you hit somebody with a hammer in the head, it's blunt damage, and you're going to do severe damage. You're going to do excess damage. You don't necessarily need a crit to do some damage to somebody. If you hit them in the groin, same thing can go down. Now, you may not kill the poor bastard, but he's going to be in a world of hurt and at an extreme disadvantage. This equates in Stellar Frontiers to negative combat modifiers and enhanced reaction modifiers to both to the surrender rules and to the fleeing rules. I mean, you take the wind out of somebody, they don't want to fight no more. And at the end of the day, what isn't that what most combat's about? It's not about the slaughter, although there's plenty of players, and a number of GMs that I've met over the years that have that base concept that this is what this is, that it's basically a meat locker, and we're in here to butcher everything we come across. That's not To me, that's not the spirit of the game system. That's not the spirit of the combat. We're not in open war where we're trying to overcome an obstacle that doesn't want to be overcome, or just happen to be it's bad luck to run into us. So our goal is to drive it off, to eliminate it as a problem, to get it to go, give up or surrender or run away. And if any of that's achieved, it's a successful encounter. Nobody had to get seriously hurt. Nobody has to die. The monster, the wild animal, whatever, it doesn't have to die. I mean, I emphasize that a couple more than one video, that we don't have to, as GMs, don't treat the bad guys and the monsters as suicidal, brain dead automatons. Oh, there are those that are. I mean, you can make an argument that certain insectoids, insect-based things, and literal automatons, golems, and magical constructs and things like that, they don't have a will. They just do what they're basically programmed to do, and that's to kill you or defend their particular corner of the whatever. And okay, so be it. But the lion's share of the things we're going to encounter at some point should have a cut and run ratio. This goes back to using those charts to speed things up. That's another thing that always bothers a lot of players or GMs, and or not always, but these protracted battles where they just seem to stretch on for an hour of game time, a half hour. I don't know what some of my contemporaries here believe is as a reasonable window of combat. I like to see most combat concluded within 15 to 30 minutes at most. If the situation is so bad that it's stretched on beyond that, either we're slowing down at the table for some reason, or the opponents, your player character, the player characters are potentially outmatched. And that's necessarily a bad thing. Not always a bad thing, but it is not the goal we want here. So part of those things we have to take into consideration. At least I like to think so. So remember, when your characters pick the hammer and its variations and variants, to keep in mind that it is a versatile tool as much as a weapon, and can be utilized in some creative and interesting ways. Thank you very much for listening to me.